We're going to take a look at how you identify outcomes and how you align your learning outcomes to the instruction, which is what Chapter 6 is all about. So we're going to cover a quick review of outcomes, writing outcomes, and making sure they align. So the ABCD theory of writing learning outcomes is make sure you identify your audience, make sure you state the behavior that's expected. It should be an observable action, and you should use really good action verbs to make sure that it's clear what you want your students to be able to do. And then you're going to include the criteria and conditions for how they're going to perform this behavior, and then the degree or the level of performance mastery that's expected. So I've included an example. Prior to completing this course, the students will be able to construct a business model for their assigned companies and include at least 5 major components. So if we break this down, prior to completing the course, that's the condition. They have to do this before they complete the course. And then the audience is the students. And what will they do? They'll be able to they're going to construct a business model for their assigned companies. And the degree to which they're going to do it, they're going to include at least 5 major components of the business model. So I broke that down into A, B, C, D, and I included an example. I'd like for you to write your learning objectives with the A, B, C, D approach. Alignment. Alignment is key to ID success and to learning success. So I put a picture of a key here to remind you of how important this is. This is a little chart that I use whenever I'm designing a course. I start with the student learning outcomes. I list them in the left-hand column. And then in my next column, I do the module or lesson level outcomes, and I list those and in the order of how they align with the student level outcomes for the course. And then in the third little tab, I do the teaching materials and learning activities that are going to align with making sure that the module lesson level outcomes are reached, which then reinforces that your course level outcomes are going to be reached. And then assessment. How am I going to assess and make sure that those learning outcomes were achieved? I'm going to list the assessments in this column, and the assessments should align with the outcomes. They should also align with the activities that we do in the course. And so then with the module level and then the course level outcomes. So alignment should be across the board. Alignment is key. Remember that. So outcomes. I just picked 3 paradigms. I did the instructivist paradigm, the constructivist paradigm, and the connectivist paradigm for learning outcomes. So from an instructivist perspective, learners need direct guidance from either materials or from an instructor. And here's an example of an instructivist outcome. After completing the instruction on sales trend analysis, students will evaluate a sales trend report on real estate and present their summaries to the class. And then from the constructivist approach, learners will explore and develop ideas. An example of a constructivist outcome: after exploring commercial real estate available for purchase in North Carolina, students will create a purchase plan for a group of properties to present to their investors. And then from the connectivist approach, learners will build connections to support their activities, and generally this is in reference to some sort of network-based digital kind of activity. So my example, after reviewing real estate web resources focused on commercial properties, students will create and share a real estate website listing their 5 top properties and list their assets. So I created 3 examples of each outcome from the instructivist, constructivist, and connectivist perspectives. This chapter also talks about backwards design. Wiggins and McTeague wrote a book called Understanding by Design, which is probably the foundational book on backwards design. And they talk about in their book 6 facets of understanding. Understanding is really hard to define, so they broke it down into 6 facets, and those 6 facets are being able to explain it. You want your learners to be able to explain the new knowledge. You want them to be able to interpret it. You want them to be able to apply it. You want them to be able to demonstrate a proficiency with this knowledge. You want them to be able to emphasize what's important in the newfound knowledge. And you also want them to be able to exhibit self-knowledge of their level of understanding. So when they explain it, they need to be able to provide data and complete facts related to their understanding of the new topic. You want them to be able to give you positive examples and tell meaningful stories using this new knowledge, and also to be able to provide an analogy when it's hard to explain. And then to apply it. They should be able to use the new knowledge. They should be able to effectively do something with that newfound knowledge, and they need to be able to apply it to a new situation. So for example, if you're teaching math and you give them 6 problems that are exactly the same, they should be able to solve those problems just with different numbers. But to really know if they understand the formula, you need to provide them with a little bit of a different twist on the problem and see if they understand it enough that they can apply it to that new situation and do it successfully. And then being able to demonstrate perspective and proficiency. Students need to be able to demonstrate that they have a solid understanding of being able to see the big picture with the information, and that they can look at the information from a variety of perspectives and evaluate the information based on context and provide an informed and critical eye when they're looking at it. And then emphasize. You want your students to be able to go in and have such an ability that they don't, to a casual observer, they might not understand the nuances and the differences, but if they really understand it, they could look at a model, let's say, and they could see the differences in 2 models that are very similar, but they could recognize the difference that a casual observer might not. And then exhibit self-knowledge. This is metacognition or metacognitive thinking, being able to reflect on their own thinking. And a good example of this is when you go in and you take a test and you go into the test and think you did really well and come to find out you blew the test. That might mean that your metacognitive thinking related to your understanding might not be exactly on target. But when you go into a test and think you really did well and you come out and you did really well, then your metacognitive thinking is probably dead on. You did know it and you were right. You knew it. So you want your students to be able to go in and say, what is understood? Yes, I understand. Here's what I know I understand. Here's why I understand it. Here's what I don't know exactly. I'm not 100% sure about. And here's why I'm unclear on this fuzzy area. So that they can be more attuned to their own thinking. And this is important because when they have a solid understanding of their own metacognitive abilities, they can be more self-directed in their learning. And that's your ultimate goal, is for them to be able to be self-directed. And beginning with the end in mind, that is backwards design. I keep going back to that. Instructional designers always begin with the end in mind. The end is you want them to be able to accomplish the goals that are your student learning outcomes. So you have to identify the desired results, and that's what we did with the learner analysis. We looked at the, we talked with our project people, what was the scope of the problem. We figured out what the problem was, and then we need to analyze the learners to see how we can best get them to a place where we can solve their problem. We determine what constitutes acceptable evidence of those results, and then in the very end, we plan our learning experiences and instruction that are geared toward producing these positive results of success. So, as some of you used instructional strategies in part 1, and that doesn't belong in part 1, in the learner analysis. That goes in part 2, and we'll talk about that as you start working on part 2. So yes, you develop your assessments at the same time as you develop your learning outcomes. I know it sounds crazy, but that is the process. When you develop your assessments, your learning outcomes, you're already thinking about, how am I going to assess this? So sometimes your assessments sound very similar to your learning outcomes, and they are supposed to, because that is a strong indicator of alignment. And I've already talked earlier about how important alignment is, so I'm going to quit harping on that, and we'll end this little conversation about assessment and alignment. I hope you find this helpful.